It started with a horse, the way things out here often do. A riderless pony stumbling through the dry creek bed below my cabin, its coat matted with sweat and its flank streaked with something dark. It was near dusk, that time of day when the shadows get long and the world holds its breath, and I was splitting the last of the winter wood. I figured the pony had tangled with a mountain lion. It happens. But then I saw her. She was still in the saddle, just barely. A girl, half hanging, one bare foot dragging in the dust. Her dark hair was a mess of thorns and twigs, and her arms were wrapped tight around her middle, clutching a wound that seemed to beat with the last of her heart. I dropped the axe. Didn't even turn to shut the cabin door. The world narrowed to the sound of my boots on the gravel and the terrified whinny of that poor horse. By the time I reached them, the girl had slumped forward, her fight all but gone. She was Navajo, no older than 15, maybe 16. Her skin had that awful gray color that comes from giving too much blood back to the earth. I eased her down from the saddle, her body feeling impossibly light, impossibly fragile. Her blouse was torn clean across the ribs, soaked through with a stain so dark it was almost black in the failing light. Even unconscious, her grip was like iron on a leather cord around her neck. A pendant hung from it, turquoise and carved bone, polished smooth from years of being held. I didn't recognize the design, a strange spiral that seemed to pull my eye into its center. But I knew what it meant. This wasn't just a random girl. This was trouble of a kind that doesn't just ride away, but you don't leave a child to die in the dust. You just don't. I carried her inside. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, and a chill had settled in the cabin, a cold that felt deeper than the coming night. I laid her on my cot, the only soft place in the whole cabin, and gently peeled back the blood-soaked fabric. The wound made me hiss through my teeth. It wasn't a clean slice from a knife. It wasn't a ragged tear from an arrowhead. It looked more like a brand, a symbol seared into her skin, still weeping blood. A shape I'd never seen before, but it felt ancient. Wrong. Gritting my teeth, I did what I had to. I boiled water, poured whiskey on the wound and down my throat, and stitched the ragged edges of her skin together with a needle and thread I usually used for mending saddles. It was clumsy work, ugly work, but it was the best I could do. She never woke up, not once, but her breathing steadied. That was something. That was enough. I sat in the dark by her side all night, my old revolver resting on my knee. My cabin sits miles from any trail, but I kept listening for hoofbeats, kept waiting for whoever did this to come back and finish the job. But no one came. Not until the sun cracked the eastern horizon like a blood orange. That's when I heard it, a low thunder that wasn't thunder. It was the sound of horses and not just one or two. It was the sound of an army. I stepped onto the porch, my hand already on the worn grip of my revolver, my eyes narrowing against the rising sun and the column of dust rolling toward me. They came over the ridge in a single, silent line. 70 riders, all Navajo, all armed. They moved with a purpose that made the hair on my arms stand up. Their faces were like stone, their eyes fixed on my small cabin. My hand dropped to my belt, my thumb finding the hammer of my gun. But I didn't draw. Something told me not to. There was no shouting, no war cries. They weren't spreading out to surround me, they just stopped. A perfect, quiet line, maybe 50 yards from my porch, the dust settling around them like a shroud. One man rode forward. He was older, with silver streaks at his temples, and eyes that had seen more than I could ever imagine. He rode with the straight-backed pride of a man who answered to no one. He stopped his horse, dismounted, and walked toward me. His steps were slow, deliberate. There was no hostility in his gait, but there was a weight to it, the weight of a world of hurt. He stopped 10 paces from my porch and just looked at me. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind whispering through the pines and the soft, steady breathing of the girl inside my cabin. Then he spoke, his voice like dry stone scraping together. "My daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "She is inside." I just nodded once. "She's alive." The man's eyes closed, just for a second, but in that second, I saw a universe of pain and relief wash over his face. Then his eyes opened again, and they were back to being unreadable stone. He stepped past my porch rail and walked right into my cabin without waiting for an invitation. I followed him, my hand still resting on my gun. He knelt by the cot, his large, weathered hand gently touching the girl's forehead. He looked at the clumsy stitches I'd put in her side. Then he looked back at me. His expression was impossible to read. "You stitched her," he said. "I did." "You gave her water, as much as she could take." He studied my face, his gaze so intense it felt like he was reading the story of my life. "You took a great risk," he said. "White men do not often help our people." "I saw a kid bleeding out," I said, my voice rough. Didn't feel like a decision. That, apparently, was the right answer. The tension in his shoulders eased, just a fraction. He stood up, towering over me in the small space. "I am Haska," he said, "chief of the Dine of the Red Water. My daughter's name is Atsa." I glanced at the girl, this Atsa. She looked so small on that cot. She didn't say anything. "She would not," Haska said simply. His jaw tightened. "She was taken. She fled. She has brought shame upon men who deserve to feel the sun no more." He turned to face me fully. "You saved her life. Now you will ride with us." I blinked. The idea of leaving my cabin, my only safe place in this harsh world, to ride into the desert with 70 warriors I didn't know. It wasn't a comfortable one. "Ride where?" I asked. "We will speak of it on the trail," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I hesitated. I looked at the face of this powerful chief. I looked at the sleeping face of his daughter, Atsa. I had no family, no kin left to speak of. My own past was a ghost I'd been running from for years. But if I had a daughter and she was hurt, I'd want someone, anyone, to help her without a second thought. I looked back at Haska, whose eyes were still locked on me, waiting. "I'll get my rifle," I said quietly. The warriors waited in perfect, unnerving silence as I saddled my horse, a tired old mare named Daisy. They wrapped Atsa carefully in thick wool blankets and placed her on a travois, a simple sled pulled behind her father's powerful black stallion. Her breathing was shallow, but it was steady. That was what mattered. We rode east, away from the familiar peaks and into the canyons that cut through the land like old scars. The rock formations twisted into shapes like the bones of forgotten giants, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the morning sun. Haska rode at the front, setting a hard pace. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words were like chipped flint. "She is strong," he said, not looking back at me. "But there are those who would use her strength against me, against our people." He was talking about enemies, not just from the outside, but from within his own tribe. I knew that story. Power always has a price, and too often, that price is paid by the innocent. I just listened, letting the rhythm of the ride lull me into a state of alert calm. Around noon, we stopped at a red rock outcropping. The warriors dismounted with a fluid grace that was mesmerizing to watch. They moved like a single organism, each man knowing his task without a word being spoken. A small fire was started. Water was passed around. Someone offered me a piece of dried venison and a fresh cloth to wipe the dust from my face. It was a gesture of respect, and I accepted it with a nod. Haska sat with me by the fire, his eyes on the horizon. "You have no family," he stated, not asked. "Not anymore," I replied. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. "Then you have nothing to lose by riding with us," he said. "And perhaps something to gain." He didn't explain what he meant. He didn't need to. I was already part of this, whether I liked it or not. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple, Haska finally told me the story, or at least the story he wanted me to hear. "Atsa was taken by a splinter group," he explained, his voice low and hard. "Warriors who believe the old ways have made us weak. They say that our treaties with your government, our attempts to live in peace, have only led to our people being scattered and broken." His gaze was distant, lost in a painful memory. "They took her to send a message to me. to show that I am not strong enough to protect what is most precious. A flicker of fierce pride lit his eyes. But they underestimated her. She escaped. On a pony half-starved and going blind, she rode through the night. She was bleeding, but she rode. That night, as the fire cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls, Atsa stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and deep. They found me across the fire. She didn't smile, she didn't make a sound, but for a single, breathtaking moment, our eyes met. Then she looked away. It wasn't much, but it was a connection, a silent acknowledgement. The next morning, we were riding again before the sun was fully up. But this time, we weren't riding away from trouble. We were riding directly toward it. The land changed as we rode east. The scrub brush gave way to hard-pan desert, where dust devils spun across the flat expanse like tormented spirits. I was riding near the front now, beside Haska. Two of his younger warriors flanked me, their faces unreadable, but their eyes were constantly flicking my way. They were trying to size me up, this strange white man who smelled of pine smoke and whiskey instead of desert sage. I didn't blame them. Atsa slept in the travois, her face peaceful for the first time. The wound was bound, her color was returning, but her silence seemed to grow heavier with every mile we covered. We were heading toward a place I'd only heard whispers about, a sharp bend in the canyon wall near where the old Santa Fe Trail forked north. There used to be a copper mining camp there, long since abandoned and left to the vultures and the wind. Why there? I finally asked Haska, my voice low. He didn't turn his head. Because they believe I will not look for them in a place poisoned by the white man's greed. It was a chilling answer, and it was the only one I got. 2 hours later, we reached the edge of a high plateau. The world fell away in a series of jagged, sun-baked shelves, and down below, in the basin, a thin thread of smoke curled up into the clear blue sky. It was too steady to be a simple campfire. Haska raised a hand, and the entire column of 70 warriors halted as one. He dismounted and crept to the edge, squinting into the distance. I followed, crouching low beside him. Down below, tucked against the canyon wall, was a makeshift camp. A cluster of lean-tos, some old canvas stretched over driftwood frames. There were 6 horses tied to a post. 2 men sat by the fire, their postures lazy and confident. There were no lookouts, no sentries. They have grown careless, Haska said, his voice a low growl. Or it's a trap, I countered. My gut was churning. This felt too easy. Everything is a trap, Haska replied, his eyes never leaving the camp. But they do not yet know that she lives. That gives us an advantage. I scanned the ridges around the camp. How many do you think are down there? I see 2. There are likely 4 or 5 more, Haska said. 2 days ago, when they took her, there were 13. So we wait for nightfall? I suggested. Haska shook his head slowly. No, we send a message first. He gave a short, sharp gesture with his hand. 2 of the young warriors who had been watching me earlier detached from the group. They moved like shadows, their bows already slung over their backs. They would circle around, find high ground, and cover the entrance to the camp. What kind of message? I asked. Haska didn't answer with words. He reached up and took a heavy pendant from around his own neck. He pressed it into my hand. It was bronze, heavy and cool, with a piece of polished obsidian set in the center. The symbol carved into it was an eagle, its wings spread wide. It felt ancient, powerful. Ride down there, alone, he commanded. They will see this. They will know you ride with the authority of the chief. A grim smile touched my lips, and they'll probably try to gut me for it. Haska's eyes met mine. Do not let them. The unease in my stomach twisted into a hard knot, but I slid the pendant over my head. It felt heavy against my chest, a weight of responsibility I hadn't asked for. I turned my horse, Daisy, and started her down the gentle slope toward the camp. Alone. A cloud of dust trailed behind me like a lit fuse. The ride into the camp was the longest of my life. I kept my hand loose on the reins, my other hand resting casually near the stock of the rifle slung across my saddle. The two men by the fire saw me coming. They stood up slowly, their hands moving toward the knives on their belts. Their faces, scarred and weathered, narrowed with suspicion. I didn't stop. I rode right up to them, stopping Daisy just a few feet away. "I come from Haska," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I bring his words." One of the men, thin and sharp-eyed with 3 angry red scars down his cheek, spat on the ground. "You lie! The chief does not speak through white men." I didn't blink. I let my eyes drift up to the ridge behind them. "Tell that to the 2 archers who have arrows aimed at your throats right now." It was a bluff, but only half a one. I couldn't see Haska's warriors, but I knew they were there. I had to trust that they were. The man's eyes flickered with doubt. He glanced at the ridge, then back at me. He hesitated, then gave a sharp nod toward a larger tent at the far end of the camp. I dismounted, my every muscle screaming at me to be ready for a fight, and walked toward it. The inside of the tent was dark and smelled of sweat, dust, and meat that had been left on the fire for too long. 2 more men were inside, sitting on crates. One was older, with a long silver beard braided down to his chest. The other was younger, his face half hidden in the shadows, but his eyes burned with a fanatic's intensity. "I speak for Haska," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. "You took his daughter. She lives. He rides with 70 warriors. He is willing to speak with those who will listen. The rest, he will bury." The younger man leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "She escaped." I nodded once. On a half-dead pony, with a brand seared into her side. She made it. The old man with the beard didn't say a word. He just let out a long, slow breath, as if all the air had been punched out of him. Then, without any warning, he tossed something at my feet. It was a piece of torn, bloodied cloth. Her blouse. "That is what is left of her place among the people," the young man snarled. "She does not belong to Haska anymore. She belongs to the new way, to what comes next." I didn't flinch. I just stared back at him, my gaze hard. She belongs to no one but herself. The air in the tent grew thick, heavy with unspoken threats. A hand drifted toward a gun belt. My own hand twitched, ready to draw. "Tell him," the old man said finally, his voice a weary rumble. "Tell Haska we will not run. If he wants blood, he knows where to find us." I nodded once, turned my back on them, the hardest thing I'd ever done, and walked out of the tent. I got back on my horse, expecting a bullet in my back at any second. But as I rode away, I heard a shout from the tent. "Let him ride!" They didn't follow. I spurred Daisy into a gallop and didn't look back until I reached the ridge. Haska was waiting, his arms crossed over his chest. Behind him, his warriors had spread out along the ridgeline, their dark forms silhouetted against the sky like gathering storm clouds. I told him what they'd said. He just nodded, his expression grim. They said what I expected them to say. I handed him back his pendant. "So what now? Do we attack?" A strange, cold smile touched Haska's lips. "No. We draw them into the open. They believe they can hide behind shadows. We will burn the shadows away." He raised his hand and gave another signal. His warriors moved with terrifying speed and purpose. Torches were lit, the flames roaring to life in the dry air. They didn't ride down into the camp. They rode along the high ridge, past the camp, and threw the torches down into the dry brush below. The fire caught instantly. It spread with a hungry roar, a wave of orange and yellow teeth chewing through the landscape. Smoke billowed up, thick and black, choking the sky. The wall of fire raced down the slope and slammed into the edge of the canyon floor. The men in the camp scattered, their shouts of alarm swallowed by the roar of the flames. Their horses screamed in terror. The canvas tents went up like paper. The fire reached an old, abandoned copper still at the far end of the camp, and the whole thing exploded with a deafening boom that echoed through the canyons for miles. Out of the smoke and chaos, 6 men came running. Only 6. The others were gone, either fled or consumed by the inferno. Haska gave no order, His warriors positioned perfectly, drew their bows as one. Arrows whispered through the air. 4 of the running men fell, their bodies twitching in the dust. 2 kept running. I saw who they were. The young fanatic from the tent, and the man with the 3 scars on his cheek, a long knife still clutched in his hand. Something inside me snapped. I kicked Daisy into a run, charging straight down the slope and into the thick, stinging smoke. I cut across the canyon floor, my eyes burning, and caught up with the scarred man at the edge of an old, abandoned copper pit. He heard me coming. He spun around, his face a mask of hate and desperation, and swung the knife. I ducked under the wild slash, rammed my shoulder hard into his chest, and sent us both tumbling to the ground. We rolled in the dust and grime, a tangle of limbs and fury. The knife skittered away into the dirt. I came up on top, my hands finding his throat, and pinned him to the ground. "You took her," I snarled, my face inches from his. "You branded her." He spat a mouthful of blood and dirt at me. "She was leverage, a key." "She's a child," I roared. "She is power," he gasped, his eyes wide with a crazed light. I didn't know what he meant. I didn't care. I drove my fist into his face, once. He went limp. When I staggered to my feet, the fire was already starting to die down. The sun was setting, casting a blood-red glow over the smoldering ruins of the camp. Haska stood on the ridge above, a silent sentinel watching the destruction. His warriors were moving through the wreckage, retrieving weapons, scattering the last of the embers. And in the travois behind her father's horse, Atsa was sitting up. She was watching, too. Her dark eyes found mine across the smoky expanse. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. And in that moment, I knew this was far from over. It was just the beginning. The canyon smoldered behind us like a cauterized wound, red embers still glowing in the dark. It would take days for the smoke to clear, and a lifetime for the memory of the smell, charred canvas and something else, something sickeningly sweet, to fade. But Haska had sent his message. The silence that followed was louder than any war cry. We made camp a few miles east, in a narrow hollow where the glow from the ruins couldn't reach us. There was no fire, just cold, jerky, stale water, and the heavy presence of 70 warriors who didn't speak unless it was necessary. The victory hadn't brought relief. It had only bought time. I sat near Atsa again. Not too close, but close enough that she knew I was there. She was awake, her eyes tracking the movements of the warriors, her small hands clenched in her lap. She glanced at me now and then, a quick, fleeting look, but it was more than before. Haska sat apart from the others, sharpening a bone-handled knife by the light of the moon. The rhythmic scrape of stone against steel was the only sound in the camp. He hadn't spoken a word since sundown. A new kind of tension had settled over us, thicker than the smoke we'd left behind. Then an old warrior, one I hadn't noticed before, stepped into the center of our circle. His beard was thin and white, and he moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man whose bones remembered 100 winters. He crouched low and pressed his palm flat against the dirt. 7 men dead, he said, his voice like rustling leaves. 3 of them I knew, 4 were strangers. He didn't look up. He just let the words hang in the cold night air. A murmur went through the warriors. Heads turned. Whispers were exchanged. Strangers? Out here? The ones we did not know, the old man continued, sifting the dust through his gnarled fingers. They had no clan markings. Their clothes were not of this land. They were not born of the people. Haska finally stopped sharpening his knife. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine in the darkness. Mercenaries, I said, the word tasting foul. Haska gave a single, slow nod. They are hiring outsiders now. Men who do not know our ways, who only know how to follow orders and collect their pay. They are building something, the old man, who I now knew was named Shaitani, said. We have heard whispers. They have been gathering men to the south, quietly at first, but now, more. They're looking for something, I said, thinking of the scarred man's last words. She is power. Or hiding it, Haska countered. His gaze was dark and troubled. Either way, They are preparing for a war. The word war landed like a stone in the quiet camp. Suddenly, Atsa stirred. All eyes turned to her. She didn't speak, but she leaned forward, her small hand reaching into a leather pouch at her side. She pulled something out and held it up for all to see. It was a stone, smooth, black, shaped like an almond. She held it flat on her palm, her arm extended. Shaitani, the old warrior, let out a soft hiss. "Where did you get that?" "She took it from their camp," I answered for her, my voice low. I remembered seeing her clutch something as I carried her away from the fire. "She's been holding on to it this whole time." Another warrior leaned closer. "That is not just a stone, it is carved." He was right. Along the side of the stone, almost invisible in the faint moonlight, was a small etching, a spiral, the same spiral I had seen on the pendant she wore, a spiral that looped outward, then coiled back in on itself. It looked ancient, older than the tribes, older than anything I had ever seen. Haska stood up, his face a mask of dawning horror. "They found something," he whispered, his voice shaking with a terrible realization. He slipped his knife back into its sheath. "And they needed her to open it." The murmurs among the warriors grew louder, sharper. I frowned, my mind racing. "What do you mean, open it? It's just a stone." Haska looked at his daughter, then at me. "She carries the bloodline, not just mine. Her mother was the daughter of the Moonsingers, a line of women who could see things others could not. That blood remembers things. It can unlock things that were meant to stay locked forever." "You think they were trying to use her?" I asked, a cold dread seeping into my bones. "I think they already tried," Haska said, his voice grim. "And when it didn't work, she ran." No one spoke for a long moment. The only sound was the wind, whispering secrets through the rocks. Then I asked the question that was burning in my mind. "Where does the spiral lead?" Atsa looked at me, her dark eyes seeming to see right through me. Then she looked down at the stone in her hand. Slowly, she raised her arm and pointed south, a direction none of them wanted to go. Later that night, long after the others had settled into a restless sleep, Haska came and sat beside me. The fire was gone, but the stars were so bright they cast faint shadows on the ground. "You saved her," he said, his voice low and devoid of its earlier hardness. "I found her bleeding in the dust," I said, shrugging. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," he said, his gaze fixed on the southern horizon. "Not anyone. You pulled the brand from her. You gave her your water. You risked your home for a child you did not know." "I didn't know who she was," I admitted. A sad smile touched his lips. "You still don't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he continued. "She is my daughter, yes, but she is more than that. There are old stories told only in whispers, of children born under a certain moon, children who do not cry at birth, who hold their breath until the hawks circle overhead, and only then do they exhale their first breath." I glanced over at Atsa, who was curled up in her blankets, her eyes wide open, staring up at the star-dusted sky. "She never cried," Haska said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not when they took her, not once." He turned to me, and in the faint starlight, I could see the fire of a terrible memory burning in his eyes. "They came in the night. 6 riders. Mercenaries. They knew exactly where to go, who to bind first. Her mother died trying to protect her. I was away, visiting a neighboring clan. By the time I returned, they were gone." He paused, swallowing hard. "They left signs behind, symbols carved into the stones of my home, the spiral, and words written in a tongue I had seen only once before, in an ancient text." "What did it say?" I asked. My voice hushed. Haska's eyes met mine, and the look in them sent a shiver down my spine. "Blood knows the gate." The air suddenly felt colder, thinner. "We thought it was a warning," Haska continued, his voice heavy with regret. Now I believe it was a map." I stared at the dark southern horizon. A map to what? A gate to where? "So where do we go now?" I asked. Haska's gaze was resolute. We follow the spiral. The decision was made without another word. Before the sun rose, we were packed and ready. We traveled light: water, dried meat, arrows, and our rifles. Atsa rode behind her father again, but this time she sat upright, her small hands holding onto the reins as if she'd been born to it. Haska gave the black almond-shaped stone to Shaitani, who tied it to his belt with a leather cord. The old man, Shaitani, now rode at the very front, guiding us not along any known trail, but toward a narrow pass that cut through a ravine scarred black with ancient ash. The cliffs on either side were shaped like leering skulls. This was a place forgotten by maps and men. On the second day, the trail narrowed even further. The wind died completely. Even the birds fell silent. The world grew unnervingly still. I rode beside Haska again. "Whatever they're hiding," I said, my voice low, "they've gone to a lot of trouble to keep it buried." "Yes," Haska agreed grimly, "which means it is worth digging up." We found the first marker near dusk, a cairn of stones stacked 7 high. Each stone was painted with black pitch, and the air around it smelled faintly of copper and burnt oil. The spiral was etched into the top stone, a perfect match to the one on the pendant and the stone Atsa had found. "They've been here," I said unnecessarily. "Not just them," Shaitani replied from the front. He had dismounted and was crouching near the stones, sifting the dust with his fingers. "Something else passed this way, something heavy." I looked at the trail. I could see the faint tracks of horses. "A wagon," Shaitani said, his voice grim. "With iron-rimmed wheels. Heading east." The path grew stranger after that. The cracked earth gave way to a crust of white salt that crunched under our horses' hooves. The plants turned brittle and pale, and the few cacti we saw seemed to lean away from the trail, as if in fear. Just before sunset, Atsa spoke for the first time in days. She pointed a small, steady hand toward the horizon. "Ashihi," she said, her voice clear and strong. Haska froze in his saddle. He turned to look at her, his face pale. "Are you sure?" She nodded once, her expression unreadable. I looked between them, confused. "What does that mean? Ashihi?" "It is not a word," Haska said, his voice strained. "It is a place, a crater, a scar on the land older than any story we still tell." "Why would they go there?" I asked. Haska's eyes were dark with a terrible knowledge. "Because that is where the dead wait." We camped that night on the edge of the crater's rim. It was a vast, gaping wound in the earth, deeper than any canyon, its sides smooth and black. The stars above were diamond-hard and cold, watching us in silence. At the very bottom of the crater sat a shape, a structure of some kind. It wasn't a cave and it wasn't a ruin. It was something else, something wrong. And as I stared at it, I realized it wasn't just reflecting the moonlight. It was pulsing, a faint, rhythmic glow, like a sleeping heart. We approached the edge of the crater in utter silence. The wind didn't blow here. It seemed to sink into the basin, pulled down by some invisible gravity that gathered at its center. Our horses refused to go any further. They dug in their hooves, their nostrils flaring with terror. Even Haska's stallion, a beast of courage and fire, pawed at the ground and backed away from the rim. "We go on foot from here," Shaitani announced, his voice a low whisper. I took one look at the steep, smooth descent, then at the strange, shimmering heat that seemed to rise from the crater's center. "What is that?" I asked. "Heat," Haska said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Or something much, much older." We tethered the horses in a rocky overhang, out of sight. Haska took the black stone from Shaitani's belt and handed it to Atsa. She held it in her small palm, her fingers wrapping around it as if it were a missing part of herself. Then we began the descent. Just me, Haska, Atsa, Shaitani, and 4 of Haska's most trusted warriors. The ground changed as we walked, from packed dirt to a hard, glassy black rock that was slick under our boots. I kicked a small piece loose, and it slid down the slope, spinning with an unnatural speed before coming to an abrupt stop. "Volcanic rock?" I whispered. "No," Shaitani said, his eyes scanning the strange landscape. This was not burned from below. This was burned from the inside out. Halfway down, Atsa stopped. She bent low, pressing her hand flat against the glassy ground, her fingers splayed wide. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Haska knelt beside her, placing his own hand next to hers. A strange stillness passed between them, a silent communication that I could feel in the air, a low hum that vibrated behind my teeth. Then, Atsa opened her eyes. They were focused, clear, and filled with a knowledge that no child should possess. "There is a door," she said. Her words cut through the silence like a knife. Not a whisper, not a guess, a statement of fact. Haska didn't even seem surprised. "Where?" Atsa turned and pointed toward the center of the basin. "Beneath the stone that breathes." I narrowed my eyes. The structure at the bottom, which had looked like a natural rock outcropping from above, now revealed its true nature. It had an unnatural symmetry, a deliberate pattern. The stone pulsed with a faint greenish light, a slow, steady rhythm like a monstrous heartbeat. As we drew closer, the heat intensified. It wasn't the heat of the sun, which had long since set. This was an internal heat, like standing too close to a blacksmith's forge. The warriors pulled their scarves over their faces, and I did the same. Only Atsa seemed unaffected, though a thin sheen of sweat glistened on her brow. We reached the edge of the structure. The surface was covered in carvings, but they hadn't been etched with tools. They had been melted into the stone itself. Spirals, interlocking and endless, the same pattern I had seen again and again. Atsa stepped forward without hesitation. She reached out and laid her palm flat against the pulsing stone. She let out a long, slow breath, and the stone seemed to exhale with her. The rhythmic pulse quickened, once, twice, and then the surface of the stone rippled like water. A section of it pulled back, receding into itself like living skin, revealing a dark, yawning opening. A tunnel sloped downward into the earth. There was no light within, no breeze, just a heavy, airless stillness that pressed in on us like the deep ocean. Shaitani lit a torch. The flame sputtered to life, but it burned with a strange, sickly blue light. "That's not right," I muttered. "No," Haska agreed, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "It is not." But we entered anyway. We had come too far to turn back now. The tunnel was steep, its walls curving inward. There were no markings here, no carvings, just the same smooth, black, fused stone that felt warm to the touch. The deeper we went, the less the torch flame helped. The blue light seemed to bend and warp, and the shadows clung to corners where no corners should exist. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel widened into a chamber. It wasn't large, but it felt vast, filled with a presence that had no name. At the far end, on a pedestal of the same black stone, sat another almond-shaped stone. It was identical to the one Atsa carried. Shaitani started to move forward, but Atsa put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She walked past us, her small form seeming to radiate a quiet power. She reached the pedestal and took the second stone in her hands. The moment her fingers touched it, the pedestal shivered, and the walls of the chamber groaned. The melted spirals on the walls began to glow with a soft, green light, illuminating the space. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my own breath. And then, a voice echoed through the chamber. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in Navajo. It was a language of clicks and whispers, a sound that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to the bones in my skull. It wasn't angry. It wasn't welcoming. It was curious. Atsa stood frozen, her eyes wide, staring at the stone in her hands. Her mouth opened slightly. "She is listening," Haska whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror. "To something we cannot hear." I took a step back, my hand reaching for my revolver. This was wrong, all of it. Should we stop her? "She was born for this," Haska said, his voice firm. Atsa knelt, placing the second stone into her pouch alongside the first. The moment the two stones touched, the pulsing heartbeat of the structure stopped. Silence. A true, absolute silence that was more terrifying than any noise. And then we heard it. Footsteps. heavy clanking footsteps, echoing from the tunnel we had just come through. They were coming closer. Haska drew his knife. Shitani unslung his bow, an arrow already knocked. I raised my rifle, my heart hammering against my ribs, and backed toward the entrance of the chamber. We were not alone down here. A light appeared in the tunnel, a strange, shimmering distortion in the air. A figure stepped into the green glow of the chamber. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. It was too tall, its limbs too long and thin. Its skin was as pale as bone, and its eyes were black voids, absorbing the light, reflecting nothing. It wore no clothes, only a strange garment made of woven cords that dangled from its shoulders like a shaman's robe. It looked at Atsa, then it looked at me, and then it spoke. The words were not human, but the meaning flooded my mind like a wave of heat. She has two. Bring the third. Then, the figure turned and simply vanished back into the darkness of the tunnel. The silence returned, heavier than before. Atsa turned to her father, her face pale but resolute. I know where it is, she said. Haska didn't ask how. He only nodded. We scrambled out of that chamber, not daring to touch the walls, and up the long, dark tunnel. When we emerged into the cool night air, the world felt different. Thinner, as if something essential had been drained from it. And our horses were gone. The tracks were deep and erratic, leading away from the crater rim. As we stood there stunned, one of Haska's warriors, a scout he'd left on the ridge, came running toward us, his face panicked. Riders, he gasped, pointing north. On the north trail, a dozen, maybe more. They wear the blue coats of the cavalry. Soldiers? I asked, my blood running cold. What were they doing out here? The scout nodded grimly. We must move, now. We set off on foot, heading east into a deep ravine that wound its way into the higher country. If Atsa was right, the third stone lay somewhere in the ruins of an abandoned Spanish mission near a place called Tres Lagunas, a place even the scavengers gave a wide berth. But we had to get there first. A storm was gathering in the west, a strange, unnatural storm with flashes of lightning that lit the sky without a sound of thunder. By dawn, we had found shelter on a narrow ledge under a rocky overhang. The rain came down in sheets, turning the canyon floor below into a raging river in minutes. We were safe, for now. Haska stood watch, his face like a granite cliff against the storm. I sat beside Atsa, the water dripping from the ledge around us. You knew he would be there, I said quietly, referring to the pale figure in the chamber. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the churning red water below. I saw him in a dream. Was that thing alive? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She turned to look at me, her dark eyes ancient and sad. No, she said, not anymore. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. Below us, the floodwaters raged, and in the distance, the thunder finally began to speak. It wasn't the sharp crack of a normal storm. It was a long, low roll, like the beat of a war drum, and it was getting closer. We left the canyon before the sun was up, the ground still slick and treacherous from the storm. The landscape had been reshaped overnight, the floodwaters carving new paths through the soft earth. The air smelled of wet clay and something else, something like ozone, the scent of raw power. I'd been to Tres Lagunas once, years ago, guiding a fool of a prospector. I remembered the ruins of the old Spanish mission. They sat on a low hill, looking out over 3 dry lake beds. It was a place that felt caught between worlds, not broken enough to be dead but too empty to be alive. The place had a bad reputation. They said the ground there was sour. We approached from the east, using the rising sun to blind anyone who might be watching. The mission came into view slowly. First the broken bell tower, leaning at a precarious angle, then the 3 crumbling arches of the main chapel, and in the center of it all, a stone well, its opening sealed with thick, rusted iron bars. Atsa led the way. She didn't hesitate, didn't need to search. She walked with a purpose that was both unnerving and mesmerizing. She passed through the shattered main doors, ducked under a sagging timber beam, and stepped into the collapsed sanctuary. Broken pews lay scattered like the ribs of a dead animal. She went straight to the altar, or what was left of it. She knelt, and with her bare hands, she brushed away a thick layer of dust and rubble, revealing a rusted iron ring set into a wooden hatch. Shaitani stepped forward to help her. Together, they pulled. The wood groaned in protest, the sound of a tomb being opened. A narrow spiral staircase descended into absolute darkness. I started to light a torch, but Atsa stopped me. "No torches," she said, her voice firm. "Why not?" I asked. "We can't see a thing down there." "It is not the darkness you need to see through," she said, her gaze intense. "It is what waits within it." Haska nodded in agreement. "We go without flame." So we did. The descent was terrifying. The air was thick and wet, and the walls weren't stone, but packed earth held in place by rotting timbers. The smell was overpowering: mold, stagnant water, and the faint, sweet scent of decay. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a small, circular chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, most of them collapsed. But on the ones that remained, there were ancient scrolls, clay jars sealed with wax, and bones wrapped in linen. And in the center of the room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, was a man. He wasn't breathing. He hadn't breathed in a very long time. His skin was stretched tight over his bones like dried leather, and his eyes were gone, leaving only dark, accusing sockets. But he was sitting upright, his arms crossed over his chest, as if he were merely waiting. Atsa walked forward, her steps silent on the dirt floor. She knelt before the corpse and spoke, but the voice that came out of her was not her own. It was a chorus of whispers, a language of sand and wind that I had never heard. The corpse twitched. Slowly its right hand uncurled, the fingers creaking like dried twigs. In its open palm lay the third stone. It was identical in shape to the others, but the spiral carved into it was different, more complex. Atsa took the stone with both hands and bowed her head. The moment she lifted the stone from its palm, the corpse collapsed. Not slowly, but all at once, as if the invisible thread holding it together had been cut. It dissolved into a fine gray dust that settled on the floor. In a heartbeat, there was nothing left but a thin layer of powder and the overwhelming silence. No one spoke. We ascended the stairs, blinking as we stepped back into the harsh daylight. The sun felt too bright, the air too loud. And then we saw them. He was sitting on a pale horse, his back ramrod straight. He wore the long blue coat of a Union cavalry officer, but the insignia on his collar and shoulders was wrong. There were too many bars, too many medals, and they glittered with an unnatural light, as if they weren't made of metal at all. Behind him, 20 more soldiers sat on their horses, their faces shadowed by the brims of their hats. They were perfectly still, their rifles held at the ready. The leader's gaze fell on me, then on Haska, and finally, it settled on Atsa. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. His teeth were as black as obsidian. "You have the third," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was completely out of place in this desolate landscape. Atsa stepped forward, clutching the 3 stones in her pouch. The man dismounted. He didn't walk. He glided. And as he drew closer, I saw that his boots weren't touching the ground. They hovered an inch above the dust. "Give them to me, girl," he said, his smile widening. "You have no idea what you are carrying." "She knows," Haska answered, his voice a low growl. He and his warriors had fanned out, their hands on their weapons. The officer's smile never faltered. "And you are all willing to die for her. How noble." "No," Haska said, his eyes blazing. "We are willing to die with her." Then a whistle, high and sharp, pierced the air from the ridgeline above us. In an instant, the ridge was lined with dark figures. 70 warriors. Silent. Ready. The false cavalry officer's smile finally vanished. He glanced up at the warriors, then back at us. He gave a sharp, angry command. Half of his soldiers turned and spurred their horses, but they didn't ride away. They dissolved into black smoke, their forms dissipating like a bad dream. The other half, however, were very real. They raised their rifles and fired. The world exploded into a chaos of gunfire, war cries, and the whisper of arrows. The fight was brutal and short. Rifles cracked, arrows found their marks, and men, both real and not, fell to the ground. By the time I raised my own Winchester, it was already over. The pale horse stood alone, its rider gone. Only his long blue coat lay on the ground, folded neatly as if placed there by an invisible hand. Atsa walked over and picked it up. She turned it over, and from an inside pocket, she pulled a small carved object. A key, made of bone, marked with the same spiral pattern. Shitani came to her side, his gaze fixed on the pouch where she kept the stones. "They are calling to each other," he whispered. "They hum with power. 3 is not enough." Atsa looked up, her face grim. There was a 4th. I let out a string of curses under my breath. Of course there was. Haska looked down at his daughter. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a deep, weary understanding. "You know the path," he said. She nodded. "I do." "Then I will go with you." That was it. No debate, no discussion. The path was set. They turned to the northeast, toward a place called Red Bluff Canyon, a place the Navajo avoided, a place the Apache spoke of only in curses, a place where, it was said, the dead did not stay dead. As we prepared to leave the haunted ruins of the mission, I walked over to Atsa. I had to ask. "Atsa," I said, my voice low, "what happens? What happens if someone brings all 4 stones together?" She looked at me, her dark eyes holding secrets I couldn't begin to fathom. She didn't say a word. She just turned and walked away. But her silence was an answer in itself, and it was an answer that terrified me. The journey to Red Bluff Canyon felt like a march into the heart of a bad dream. The land grew more twisted, more hostile with every mile. The sky was a constant, oppressive gray, and the silence was so profound that it felt like a physical weight. We moved in small groups now, a loose formation with scouts ranging far ahead and to the sides. I rode with Atsa and Haska, the 3 of us a silent island in a sea of watchfulness. Shitani often fell back, dismounting to press his palm against the cracked earth, his eyes closed as if listening to a conversation I couldn't hear. Twice, he had us change course, veering away from a clear path for reasons he never explained. I didn't question him. I was beginning to understand that there were things in this world that you didn't see with your eyes. The sun didn't set. It just faded, bleeding out of the sky until we were riding under a blanket of darkness that was too quiet for night. We made camp only once, a cold camp with no fire. No one slept. We just sat with our own thoughts, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching us from the jagged rocks. By dawn, we saw it. Red Bluff Canyon. It didn't rise from the earth, it erupted. It looked like a wound, a place where the planet's skin had been torn open, revealing the raw, red flesh beneath. The rock strata were twisted and broken, colored in shades of rust and dried blood. There were no trails leading in. None that were known, anyway. But Atsa knew the way. She dismounted, even though the horses could have gone further. She walked to the cliff face and pointed to a narrow crack between 2 massive slabs of red rock. It was too thin for a horse, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. "I will go first," she said, her voice steady. "No," I said immediately. "It's too dangerous. We go together, or we don't go at all." Haska, who had been silent for hours, placed a hand on my shoulder. His grip was like iron. "She leads," he said, his voice absolute. "We follow." There was no arguing. I unstrapped my rifle, tied Daisy's reins to a gnarled juniper tree, and squeezed into the crevice after the girl. The rock was cold and oppressive, closing around us like a throat. The passage twisted and turned, getting narrower and narrower until I thought we would be trapped. Then, it opened up into a hidden hollow. It was a perfect circle, carved by wind and time, but it felt deliberate, shaped. The walls were covered in petroglyphs, but they were unlike any I had ever seen. They weren't etched, They were clawed into the stone, vicious, angry marks, spirals that seemed to writhe, animals with too many eyes and hands with too many fingers. And one figure, repeated over and over, a faceless man with a long, emaciated body and no legs. Instead of legs, there were roots, hundreds of them, spreading like dark veins across the rock face. Shaitani let out a strangled gasp when he saw it. His face was ashen. "It is him," he whispered. "Him who?" I asked. "The one who sleeps beneath," he said, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in the old man before. We passed under a natural stone arch, and the world changed again. We stepped out into a flat, open field. The ground was dead white. A fine, chalky soil cracked like the bottom of a sun-baked lake. There was no brush, no grass, not a single living thing. Atsa didn't stop. She walked to the very center of the dead field. There, 4 black stones jutted from the ground, forming a perfect square. They were smooth and featureless, each one identical in size and shape. She knelt. With hands that did not tremble, she opened her pouch and removed the 3 stones she carried. She placed one on each of the first 3 corners of the square. Then, Haska stepped forward. He held the bone key they had found in the officer's coat. He placed it in the center of the square. Silence. Then, thunder. Not from the sky, which was still a flat, empty gray. The thunder came from the ground beneath our feet. The 4 stones in Atsa's pouch and the bone key began to glow with a sickly green light. The light grew brighter, more intense. The cracks in the white soil widened, spreading out from the stones in a spiderweb pattern. And then, with a sound like a giant bone snapping, a massive slab of earth in the center of the square split open. Dust flew outward in a slow, silent spiral, and from the darkness below, something rose. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. It had a body, limbs, but they were all wrong. Too long, bent at impossible angles, as if its joints had been broken and reset 100 times. Its face was covered by a mask of carved stone, fused directly to its head. It said nothing, but a voice screamed inside my head, a voice of dust and decay. "You have woken me." Atsa trembled, but it wasn't with fear. It was with a terrible, dawning recognition. "This is what was sealed," she whispered. "Not just the stones. Him." Haska's warriors readied their weapons, but it was too late. The creature moved. Not fast, but with an unstoppable inevitability, like a flood or a landslide. It raised one long skeletal hand, and the ground itself answered. The white dust rose up, taking shape, forming specters of men, their eyes burning with a cold, dead light. One of the specters tackled a warrior, its touch turning the man's flesh to gray dust. Another lunged for Shaitani. The old warrior raised his staff, a gnarled piece of ironwood, and screamed a single guttural word in his own tongue. The specter paused, writhed as if in agony, and then exploded into a cloud of ash. That gave us an opening. I raised my Winchester and fired, the shot echoing like a cannon in the dead silence. The bullet hit the creature square in its stone mask. It staggered, but only for a moment. Then it turned its head and looked directly at me, and beneath the mask, something opened. It wasn't eyes. It wasn't a mouth. It was a patch of absolute nothingness, a void that threatened to pull the very soul from my body. I nearly dropped my rifle. Haska shouted for a retreat, but it was useless. The canyon walls were shifting, the massive slabs of rock twisting inward like the jaws of a closing trap. We were sealed in. Then, Atsa did something that no one, not me, not her father, not the creature itself could have expected. She walked forward. She held her hands out, palms up. The 3 stones rested in one palm, the bone key in the other. The creature paused. The specters of dust stilled. Atsa spoke. But it wasn't her voice. It was the chorus of whispers from the tomb, the voice of sand and wind. "We are not your jailers," the voice said, echoing not from her lips, but from the very air around her. "We are what remembers you." The ground stopped trembling. The wind returned, a soft, gentle breeze. Time seemed to slow down. The creature, the ancient thing that slept beneath the earth, did something impossible. In a movement that was almost gentle, it knelt, and then it crumbled. Not into ash, but into rich, black, living soil. The stones in Atsa's hand cracked, the pieces falling to the new earth and disappearing as if they had never been. All 3 stones, and the bone key, were gone. And the canyon went silent. A true, deep silence. The kind of silence that comes after something ancient and terrible has finally finished breathing. We stood there, stunned, for what felt like an eternity. The canyon was no longer a place of death. The air was clean. The sky was turning blue. Haska turned to me, his face a mixture of awe and fear. "You see now what she is." He looked at his daughter, who stood in the center of the newly formed patch of fertile earth. "She is not a child." "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "She's not." "Is she?" He couldn't finish the question. "She is what they needed her to be," I said, not knowing where the words came from. Atsa walked back toward the archway, her steps steady and sure. We followed her, a silent, shaken procession. When we reached the edge of the canyon and looked back, the white, dead field was gone. In its place was a small meadow of lush green grass. As we stood there, catching our breath, trying to make sense of what we had just witnessed, Atsa looked at me. Her face was calm, her eyes clear. "Where to now?" I asked, my voice still shaky. She looked past me, toward the endless horizon. Her voice, when she spoke, was her own again, but it was different, stronger. "There is still one more who remembers," she said, "and he is not buried." The journey out of Red Bluff Canyon was a slow, contemplative affair. The world seemed new, freshly painted. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the song of birds and the rustle of wind through the scrub. But the change was more than just physical. It was in us. Atsa rode in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of fear, but of profound knowledge. Her posture was straighter, her gaze steady. She was no longer just a chief's daughter. She was something more, something ancient given form. Shaitani, the old warrior, kept a respectful distance from her, his eyes filled not with fear, but with reverence. The other warriors treated her with a new kind of deference. They had seen what she could do. They had seen what she was. I was the only one who still wrestled with it. 1 minute, she was the girl I had pulled bleeding from the dust. The next, she was a force that could command the earth itself. I rode beside her, the questions burning in my throat, but I kept them to myself. Some truths I was learning, you had to wait for. We didn't head back toward Haska's lands. We didn't head toward my cabin. Atsa knew where we needed to go, and Haska simply nodded and followed her lead. We rode west into a part of the territory that was marked on maps as unexplored. Past strange stone markers that no known tribe had carved, past old wells choked with weeds, past fences snapped like dry bones. The sky itself seemed to dull, the vibrant blue fading to a colorless gray as we approached our destination. The air grew still and heavy. We found the town at dusk. It had no name on any map, just a collection of skeletal buildings half buried in red dust. A church steeple broken in half, a well sealed with stone, doors that hung open on buildings that no longer had walls. There were no birds, there was no wind. The air didn't move, it clung to you like a shroud. Atsa dismounted first. "This is the place," she said. I swung down from Daisy, my hand resting on my rifle, and followed her into the ghost town. The others fanned out, their eyes scanning the empty windows and dark doorways. We found him in the church, or what was left of it. He was sitting on the floor, where the altar would have been, his head bowed, his hands resting in his lap. The last of the day's light, filtering through the broken roof, caught the silver in his long beard. He looked up as Atsa stepped inside. His eyes were milky, not from blindness, but from an ancient weariness. "So you came," he said. His voice was a dry rustle, like leaves skittering across pavement. I was beginning to think you wouldn't. I stepped forward, my rifle held at the ready. "You're the one," I said. "The last one who remembers." The old man didn't look at me. His milky eyes were fixed on Atsa. I saw you once, child, when you were very small, before the stones were broken and scattered. Your mother brought you to me. She told me your name. Atsa's face remained impassive. What happened here? She asked. A sad, knowing smile touched the old man's lips. What always happens. Men dig where they shouldn't. They find things they don't understand. And when they get scared, they try to bury it again, but they always forget that the hole is still there. She took a step closer. You know what I carry inside me. He nodded slowly. Not the name, but the weight. Yes, I know the weight. His gaze drifted up to the broken beams of the roof. They will always try to bury it again. It is their nature. Should I let them? Atsa asked, her voice quiet but firm. The old man looked back at her, and for the first time, a flicker of light appeared in his milky eyes. No, he said. Then he pushed himself to his feet. He wasn't a tall man, but as he stood, the ruined church seemed to shrink around him, the air growing thick and heavy. You must finish what your mother started, he said. She died for it. You might too. He reached into the pocket of his long, dusty coat and pulled out something wrapped in a piece of faded red cloth. He held it out to her. I took a step forward instinctively. What is it? The old man finally looked at me. His gaze was ancient and piercing. Your part in this is done, Ryder. You kept her safe. You brought her here. That was your purpose. She's just a girl, I protested, my voice weak. She was, he agreed. Not anymore. Atsa took the wrapped object. She didn't open it. She just held it in her hands, then turned and walked out of the church. The old man watched her go. You kept her alive, he said to me. For that you have my thanks. I hesitated, my hand still on my rifle. What's in the cloth? He smiled that sad, weary smile again. The memory of a promise. Then he sat back down on the floor, crossed his arms over his chest, and closed his eyes. I waited, but he didn't move again. His part was done too. I walked out of the church and into a world that was holding its breath. Atsa stood in the center of what had once been the town square. Haska and his warriors had formed a wide circle around her. Haska stepped forward. Is it time? He asked, his voice filled with a solemn reverence. She nodded once. She handed him the cloth-wrapped object. He didn't unwrap it. He knelt and with his finger began to draw in the dust. A large, complex circle, filled with symbols I didn't recognize. The other warriors came forward and joined him, their fingers tracing the ancient patterns in the red earth. They didn't chant. They didn't speak. They worked with a focused intensity, a shared purpose that was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. Shaitani came and stood beside me. He put a hand on my shoulder. This part, he said quietly, is not for you to understand. It is only for you to witness. So I did. I watched as they completed the circle. I watched as Atsa stepped into its center. Haska placed the wrapped object on the ground before her. She knelt, and with slow, deliberate movements, she unwrapped the red cloth. Inside was a piece of bone. Not human bone. Something else. It was carved and painted with spirals and symbols, a totem of immense power. The moment it was exposed to the air, it began to pulse with a soft white light. Then it cracked. A sound like 1,000 silent screams filled the air, a sound I felt in my teeth and in my soul. A wind rose up from the ground, a wind that carried whispers, songs, warnings, and names. The dust lifted, swirling around Atsa in a miniature cyclone. The warriors bowed their heads. Atsa stood up, her arms spread wide, and the totem burned, not with fire, but with pure white light. The light surged outward in a wave of cleansing energy that passed through everything. Through me, through the warriors, through the ruined buildings, through the very sky itself. For a single, blinding moment, the world turned white. And then, it was over. The town was still, but it was no longer dead. A blade of green grass poked through a crack in the dust. The wind that blew was real, and it carried the scent of rain and living things. The broken steeple of the church seemed to stand a little straighter. Atsa stepped out of the circle. The totem was gone, reduced to a pinch of white ash in her palm. She opened her hand, and the wind carried the ash away. "It is done," she said. I looked at Haska, at Shitani, at the new green world around us. What did you do?" Atsa looked at me. She was no longer a child. She was no longer a vessel for ancient power. She was just herself. And she smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "I remembered," she said, "what they paid to forget." That night, we built a fire, the first in what felt like a lifetime. We sat around it, sharing food and stories. Atsa said little, but she didn't need to. The silence was finally peaceful. The dead had stopped whispering. The living could finally speak again. By morning, the warriors would ride east, back to their people, back to a world that had been healed. Atsa would go with them, to lead them into this new future. I would not. I stood by the old stone well as the sun climbed the sky, my pack slung over my shoulder, my rifle strapped to my back. Haska walked over to me. "You could come with us," he offered. I shook my head, a small smile on my face. "I think I've seen enough for one lifetime." He nodded, understanding. "Then may your trail be clear and your water be sweet." We clasped hands, a bond of brotherhood forged in fire and shadow. Atsa came over. She didn't say anything. She just reached up and gave me a quick, fierce hug. It was enough. As the thunder of their horses faded to the east, I turned and faced the west. I didn't know what was over the next ridge, or the one after that. For the first time in years, I wasn't running from a past that haunted me. I was just walking toward a future that was finally my own. The world had shifted, the ghosts were at peace, and the path ahead was clear. If you enjoyed this story, and you want to hear more strange tales from the forgotten corners of the world, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what we'll uncover next.